Hey, good morning, everyone. It is Patrick Lovell coming at you, truth bombing on April 16th, 2023, which is a Sunday, and it looks like it's about 10:20 a.m. my time. I'm going to try to keep this as tight as possible, but as those of you who have been paying attention and have come on board investing, being an early adapter to our tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption, I thank you. Please get the information to 13 people as quickly as you can. Our objective is to get to 1,300 first early adopters to save the world. You'll go down in history as the right guys that did the right stuff at the right time. You will go down and you will be legends. And all you have to do is understand what it is that I'm bringing to your attention, which are these truth bombs and the information that I'm bringing so that we can consolidate through an effort to create this absolute movement that has to happen now. And so all I'm asking is for you to invest, not to donate, not to think of it as charity. It's to save the democracy of the United States in a way where you don't have to pick up a gun and actually go fight for it. This is the first step to trying to do it the right way before the whole thing blows up, and that might be sooner than later. And oh, by the way, it's been blowing up for the last 20 years ad nauseum, so we can just add like whatever's coming next to the frickin' pile of insanity. But the long and the short of it is, if we can get 1,300 early adapters to invest $13 by April 28th, we'll get on first base. What are we going to do? I'm going to create a podcast. Then we're going to start building the trust. I've got to get, I've got to get organized. We've got to get a 501c3 or C4, depending on what focus that we need to do. And I got to get legal representation to help with that because I've got a larger vision. We got to fund the podcast where I'm going to give you information that nobody else has access to. And then ultimately, we're going to build this, what I call a massive movement, which is going to be kind of a national barnstorming tour. If those of you who are like me, ex-gen, you got to relate it to a Live Aid event, but I'm going to take all across the country where I'm going to reveal the truths to you of what our system actually is, how it works, who got away with what they did, when they did it, why they did it, and why we're in the situation that we're in. I call it corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate that fuels the mafiocracy with socialism to guarantee criminality on a massive scale that you've never, ever could possibly envision was possible, that ultimately is now fueling fascism because of the culture wars, because that keeps this goddamn fucking beast insulated. What I learned a long time ago was the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist, because they were pissing on my head, telling me it was rain, because they must have thought I was some kind of new fool. I'm not their bitch. I'm not expendable. Chances are you're not either. I need people that are warriors for justice to crusade. Why am I shouting? Well, because there's a lot of competition for your attention out there. And there's, like, for example, for me, I was on TikTok this morning. I have to set my alarm for 5 minutes or I get sucked in. There's a lot of funny things and cool things and awesome things that I watch. And suddenly I'm like, what am I doing? I got things to do. I got to help I've got to save the world. Who am I? I'm a muckraking journalist. I've been on an adventure for 13 years that aggregated by me being able to do what I do as a producer to find a partner that invested $4.5 million for me to travel around the country to get the answers that the sum total of all of our media and ultimately the Department of Justice, the FBI, the SEC, and AGs around the country weren't able to do on a national level, because the power that controls this system is corruption, and they don't want you to understand what it is that I went on this insane odyssey to find. And by insane, I mean I sacrificed everything to get these truths. Why? Because liberty and justice for all and the integrity of law means something to me in a way that I think is beyond anything else that's important in this world. And so ultimately, what I found was that the Federal Reserve used Federal Reserve Act 13.3 to provide $29 trillion to backstop, which was a criminal racket that destroyed the world, that was a mafiocracy that we show you in www.thecon.tv, that ultimately lays out the entire case. Who am I? I'm a modern day muckraker, but I'm also an investigator, and I may as well be what happened in the history of the United States before, when after the Great Depression, we had a crack prosecutor by the name of Ferdinand Pecora who reached into Wall Street secrets, pulled them out, showed them to the world, and government actually responded of, by, and for the people, and we created laws like the Glass-Steagall Act. And then we also created the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 and 34, which are the cops on the beat to prevent massive racketeering in a way that ultimately we unleashed the freaking demons in the shadows through deregulation, ultimately during the Clinton administration. There's a thing that's happening right now that some of you are tapping into. Epstein. Everybody wants to know about Epstein, right? A lot of people. That's enough to penetrate the bubble of all of this mishigas and everything that's going on. Then it kind of skews to the right because the right are all about, oh yeah, sex trafficking and Pizzagate and I can't even think of the term, but, in terms of like, let's say, almost like vampire-esque, it's the new blood libel that there's people in the shadows that are in power that are basically sucking on the innocent of the victims through sex trafficking. Well, yeah, that actually does happen. And quite frankly, in the case of Epstein was just involved with, as far as I can tell, something that's been going on for probably ever, which is you use sex to basically set people up. For example, powerful Congress people or powerful people in general that might be heads of companies and everything else that have families and a lot to lose if they're found out that they're having some sort of sexual engagement with a minor. That's something that could destroy somebody that's powerful, and it's called leverage and information. And as it appears to me, Epstein was working with either the CIA or somebody else at Mossad, and he was also involved with billionaires, and this whole thing was a racket, and yeah, it was also the Clintons were involved. There's no question. I don't know if Hillary Clinton had any knowledge of it. Obviously, I'm absolutely certain Bill Clinton did, but how does that fit into everything that I'm telling you? Well, look, man, in the con, we show you how the 2008 great financial crisis happened. Nobody else has. There was a wonderful film back in 2011 called Inside Job that won the Academy Award that did an amazing first look at what took place. In fact, the director, Charles Ferguson, stood up in front of the world when he received his Academy Award and he said, look, we haven't done anything with prosecution of the guys who actually did this thing. And he was right. Then he somehow went a little bit, I don't know if he got silenced, but he disappeared. He certainly wasn't as high octane as he was at that moment. And I ended up picking up the pieces of the puzzle, and I put the whole thing together because I worked with the guy, and I discovered by a miracle on a Sunday morning when I discovered this television show, Bill Moyer's Sunday, on PBS, where a gentleman by the name of William K. Black was laying out what took place during the savings and loan crisis. And he was a general counsel of the Office of the Thrift Supervision, and also he was on the board of the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, which many of you may have heard about recently in the whole drama filled with the bank run of Silicon Valley Bank. But at that time period, he was a crack investigator with his crew that put together criminal referrals on a massive level, 30,000 of which led to 1,000 criminal convictions that spawned especially from these elite white-collar criminals, including none other than Charles Keating. Charles Keating was the CEO of Lincoln Continental, which was the largest bankruptcy at the time. Ironically and interestingly enough, and maybe not so ironically, one of his top economists was a gentleman by the name of Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan was a jazz-playing freaking economist. He just happened to like Ayn Rand, which was hands-off laissez-faire capitalism, i.e. no regulation. He becomes, under the Reagan administration, the Federal Reserve Chairman, and then ultimately lasts all the way through the Clinton administration and all the way through right about, well, every administration through the Bush administration until about a year before the collapse of the Great Financial Crisis, and then he just mysteriously vanished when the whole thing was on him, okay? All of those answers are on www.thecon.tv. But why is it important? Well, because in the con, for example, we show you former Treasury Secretary under the Clinton administration who was involved with the president's working group at that time, who involved Arthur Levitt and Bob Rubin and Alan Greenspan and Sandy, no, it wasn't Sandy Wild, that he's important in this conversation, but boy, who am I thinking of? Larry Summers, of course, from Harvard. And these guys did deregulation personified after the savings and loan crisis. Well, why is that important? Well, ultimately, what they did was they got rid of the rules and the regulations and the law that we actually reigned what we call the animal spirits of Wall Street, which is basically deception to get quick bucks based on Ponzi schemes and misinformation and direction and deception and all sorts of fucking variables of criminality. And ultimately, we got rid of all of these laws that we put in place after the Great Depression to rein in the beast of greed and fucking criminality, right? But ultimately, we ended up taking off all of those shackles in the late 90s under the Clinton administration, who, as I just laid out, put all of this sort of thing in play in addition to being involved with Epstein and the billionaires at that time, because anybody who knows anything about the Clinton administration understands that he basically took the Democratic Party from being of the unions and the people and the working class and all that same stuff, and he merged it into what we call the Wall Street meritocracy. But ultimately what they did at that time period was they created massive criminal engineering of fucking fraud, which is Ponzi scheme bullshit, which is what we lay out to you in in www.thecon.tv. But why is it relevant to Epstein? Well, Epstein, as it turns out, just like Bernie Madoff, was doing its business, its banking with Chase. Who was the CEO of Chase? Well, none other than a guy by the name of Jamie Dimon. And Jamie Dimon is like the guy the New York Times now wants to go to as the guy that's the dude who's going to save the latest banking run, just like he saved the banking run back in 2008, which he didn't. The government did, because the Bear Stearns rollout, the way that the New York Times is framing it now, is that ultimately Jamie Dimon stepped up with Chase to basically save the day, in a run on the markets. No, he didn't. Basically, the government guaranteed Chase buying Bear Stearns at pennies on the fucking dollar, and they used Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which ultimately used BlackRock to administer the whole thing. But they do this all behind the scenes that led to $29 trillion fucking dollars that went backdoor to this system that blew up the world. And by the world, I'm talking they got at least 50 million people in the 2008 great financial crisis, and they got tens of millions more around the world. They buried homeowners, borrowers, and then they married it to the pensioners, the working class, and both of those could, in a very shortcut, abbreviated way, represent Black Lives Matter and MAGA, ironically, that they then divide and conquer, right? Ultimately through Trump, because it's all a bunch of sham show bullshit that ties back to the 80s to this SNL crisis stuff. Back then we had the junk bonds. We had the savings and loans, and then we had, guys like Michael Milken and all of this stuff. And oh yeah, by the way, it involved Secord and all of these guys that were involved with the military-industrial complex. And back in the 80s, we had this situation that was called Contragate, where ultimately we were, taking drug money, and then we were doing gun running in the Middle East and selling arms to Iran, when, of course, Iran was supposedly our enemy because of the hostage crisis. And yet there was all sorts of manner, shape, or form, but they used the goddamn banks to do it, particularly the savings and loans and the junk bonds, which Milken and all these guys were involved with, which they learned about predation, predatory lending. They ultimately hollowed out, which was the golden goose at that time. We created this massive globalism, and globalism has been around since mankind started, but this is a different form of globalism. We call it neoliberalism. It's been basically on the march for the last 4 decades, and then ultimately what it did was it just destroyed the American middle class. And it created a looting society, which ultimately created the mafiocracy. Maybe it was designed that way from the beginning. These guys would have to absolute geniuses to see that far down the road. But ultimately, as it ties back to Epstein and Chase, was Jamie Dimon was doing all of this stuff, knowing who Epstein was and what he was doing, just like he knew what Bernie Madoff was doing and what he was up to. But Jamie Dimon came out of this scenario with Sandy Weill, where they created this super bank after they were involved with predatory lending in Baltimore in the late 90s. And under travelers and everything else, they created this mega super bank, which they got rid of all of the regulation to be able to prevent all of these different methodologies because of the Glass-Steagall Act, and then they created what was known as the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, and then they created this deregulation, and ultimately that led to the world being blown up, that they then backstopped $29 trillion in 2009, and they've done another $30 trillion since. So we've got all of these problems in society, right, that I continue to tell you we can't change through the democratic process because the system is corrupt. And it's a corporate fascist system undergirded by a criminal syndicate that has used socialism to pay and guarantee the mafiocracy that is now, giving us fascism. Okay? So if you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in integrity, in dignity, in liberty and sustainability, and we unite, we can defeat tyranny and usher in, a magnificent future that is our destiny, because we can solve all the problems. We've got the brain power, but we've got to get rid of the tumor of corruption. I am leading this movement. I've got all of the information. It's taken me years and years to aggregate. All you got to do is check out www.thecon.tv. Check me out on YouTube and TikTok, Patrick Level Truth Bombs the Con, and also check out The Real Progressives called The New Untouchables. I've got all this information and then some. I've got the information that the sum total of our institutions that get paid $100 billion a year to prevent what it is that I'm telling you, they didn't do. And the difference between me and everybody else who's raising money because they've got a problem and they've got a really horrid situation, they need attorneys and everything else, hopefully you can spread the wealth. But I'm asking you to invest $13 in me because I've invested $4.5 million to get these truths that the entire sum total of government who's there to do what it is that I had to do, and we did it. We got all the information. I've got the truth and then some. I just was watching yesterday, literally, I was watching, there's this incredible defense attorney down in Miami by the name of Bruce Jacobs, who is about to have his bar license ripped from him from telling you the truth, just like I am. And what they're doing is they're circling the wagons, and they're just basically lying and deceiving and hiding all of this information I'm saying. And by the way, in this particular case, it's insane. They're women doing this. They're women that are bought into the system because they're getting paid to do it, just like Harvey Weinstein's fucking HR that allowed females to get raped. It's sick. And then, of course, we're talking about in the last couple of weeks, right? We've got the show trial of Donald Trump, and everything that I'm telling you, he's a reflection in the mirror of, and there's more to come, especially through Letitia James. The AG of New York is going to just about to roll out everything that Donald Trump is guilty of that ties back to everything I'm telling you, and a reflection of everything else, and proof that we have the laws to rein this in, but they don't do it for the fucking machine. Donald Trump is a mid-level player at best. And then on top of all of this stuff, we got the word that Clarence Thomas, even though I knew it for the last couple of years, anybody paying attention to it, that he was on the take. Now this time it turns out he's on the take from a white billionaire out of Dallas who's a real estate guy and a big Republican contributor and donator or whatever. For what? Conservative values and everything else? Well, it's also just like what took place back in the savings and loan crisis when Charles Keating, who was the top dog, the CEO at Lincoln Continental, literally was this guy who was raping and cheating widows out of their freaking retirement. But on a front-facing matter, he was this conservative Christian guy that literally created this anti-pornography campaign. That's how these fuckers do it. This is the fucking formula. Lie, deny, switch the blame, and implicate, okay? What we've created is this insane mafia-ocracy that has controls because of the lies and the deception that we've seen on display just recently with Fox News, which in the Dominion lawsuit has been proved that they knew the whole thing that they were involved with was a complete lie, but they did it because they wanted to sell the right-wing Republicans who are eyeballs that they sell commercial advertising to tell them a story that they wanted to hear, even though it was a bunch of lies. And so that's part and parcel. But do you think they're the only ones? No! The entire media covered up what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is that this system got 50 million Americans, including myself, and they buried us through a fucking racketeering enterprise. I went on this insane journey where I kept pulling and pulling and pulling and pulling the threads until I found the whole fucking thing. And it took resources. It took time. It took energy. I'm a professional at this stuff, even though I'm yelling at you at the top of my lungs, because again, I know you've got a choice to see, some hot chick dancing on a pole on TikTok or surfing or everything else that we might like to do, instead of listening to how your country is getting fucking stolen from you, and that we are not of, by, and for the people. We are of, by, and for the corruption. This whole movement has got to electrify tens of millions of people. I really want 13 million people, but I got to start with 1,300 early adopters. We've got 54 now. That means that, we need, 1,246 new contributors. Investors, early adapters, to save our country, because we've got to create what I'm going to do. We're going to do a podcast first to bring you this information that's coming to you, and we're going to get structured in 501c3, c4, and then what we're going to do is we're going to build the audience. And if we get 13 million of you to freaking wake up, to come out of this situation that they're fucking controlling your mind like the goddamn Borg or some fucking Orwellian bullshit, and we're going to overwhelm this thing because we're going to fight for liberty and justice for all. I want to create a barnstorming revival tour with all of the information that I have that goes out and brings this to the truth of the people so they get off their phone, they come together, and it's like, back in the 80s, for those of us who came from that time period, think of me as Bob Geldof and the whole situation with Live Aid. We got to overwhelm the distraction. We've got to overwhelm the noise. When they turn down the noise and go silent, turn up the volume. The truth has got to have more value than the sum total of this insane lies of this system that has betrayed us. There's one of two ways this is going to fucking end. One, they're going to bury us even further than they already have, which is going to make it worse for everybody. And in a nutshell, this is how it all comes down to. Billionaires have grifted trillions to buy the system to make sure they control the system and the courts and anybody who can hold them accountable while burying you. I'm not expendable. Chances are you're not either. The greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. I got tired of them pissing on my head telling me it's rain. What about you? All you got to do is, because they're spending billions of dollars to buy this country, to buy the media, to buy everything to make sure that you don't understand who did what, when and how, and what they got away with. And let me tell you something. It's not just the Jews. It's not just the black people. It's not just the women. It's everybody on all sides. I learned a long time ago that you got two columns of our soul. You got integrity, character, and dignity on one side, and decency. And then on the other side, you got complicity, hypocrisy, duplicity, insidious behavior that's just lie, rotting lie. And ultimately, what we have to do is all of us, we have to skew one way or the other, depending on the circumstances. And you might think I'm manic because you see, one day I'm like a little calm, one day I'm a little bit more fired up, one day it's long, one day it's short, whatever. The bottom line is, God damn it, I've got the fucking truth that could take the machine of corruption down if I have millions of you join me. Where are the original 1,300 of you that will change history and rise above the madness, just like our forefathers did, the Patriots who defeated King George III, the Patriots who defeated the Confederacy, the Patriots who defeated the goddamn Nazis? If you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in dignity, decency, liberty, integrity, and justice for all, unite to purge tyranny, we will achieve a destiny that makes the world work in the way that it can, because we're human beings. We can adapt, we can overcome, and we can solve any problem that there is. We just can't bend the knee in the head and stay down for the corrupt, the bullies that will own you, that will plug you, that will destroy you if you don't rise for liberty. Failure is not an option. Rise, roar, revolt. Onwards and upwards.